President Trump has been clamoring for the Federal Reserve to lower interest rates, and he may finally get his way later this year with Kevin Warsh as the new Fed chair. But he shouldn't have to wait that long. Trump's appeal to the Fed has been on the grounds that inflation is much lower than what's being officially reported. And it turns out Trump is spot on, with today's real inflation rate being only 1/3 the official metrics. In fact, these numbers come from the real-time price aggregator Truflation, which monitors millions of prices every single day. That is orders of magnitude more than the Bureau of Labor Statistics, or BLS, which only observes a few thousand prices just 3 times per month. Hi, this is E.J. Antoni for the Daily Signal. President Trump has been clamoring for the Federal Reserve to lower interest rates, and he may finally get his way later this year with Kevin Warsh as the new Fed chair, but he shouldn't have to wait that long. Trump's appeal to the Fed has been on the grounds that inflation is much lower than what's being officially reported, and it turns out Trump is spot on, with today's real inflation rate being only 1/3 the official metrics. In fact, the real rate of inflation is less than half of the Fed's 2% target. These numbers come from the real-time price aggregator Truflation, which monitors millions of prices every single day. That is orders of magnitude more than the Bureau of Labor Statistics, or BLS, which only observes a few thousand prices just 3 times per month. So that's a point to Truflation, which certainly has the law of large numbers on its side, to say the least. According to Truflation, prices have risen an average of just 0.9% over the last 12 months, meaning they're virtually flat. That's an average monthly increase of less than 0.1%, which is about as good as it gets outside of a recession, especially when the Fed is engaged in money printing, euphemistically called quantitative easing. Now, this is the point where we need to distinguish between prices and inflation, because there's a lot of confusion around these terms. Inflation is the rate at which prices are rising, not prices themselves. Lower inflation means prices are going up slower, not that prices are going down. Imagine you're driving down the highway at 60 miles per hour, and you see mile markers on the side of the road increasing as you drive along. The mile markers are where you are, and your speed is how fast you're moving. So think of prices as those mile markers and your speed as the inflation rate. If your speed stays steady at 60 miles per hour, the mile markers will continue going up at 1 mile per minute. So this is the inflation rate staying steady and prices continuously rising. Now imagine you run into traffic and your speed slows by half to 30 miles per hour. You'll notice the mile markers keep going up as you drive along, but now it takes 2 minutes to cover a mile instead of 1. Think of this as slower inflation. If traffic turns to a standstill, then your speed drops to 0. At that point, the mile markers aren't going up at all. Think of this as no inflation. But you'll notice that the mile markers aren't going down, meaning prices aren't getting lower. If you want that to happen, you have to start going in reverse. We call that deflation, something that we've seen in only select products like eggs, gasoline, and rents in several major metropolitan areas. With that out of the way, back to our regularly scheduled program. Truflation's annual inflation rate of 0.9% is now much lower than the official inflation rate of 2.7% from the Consumer Price Index, or CPI. Now, it's worth noting that Truflation is not normally so much lower than the CPI, but instead usually correlates 97% with the official CPI, meaning the indexes track extremely closely with one another. Truflation is not some cockamamie guessing game, but a highly accurate and scientific project to create up-to-the-minute information on inflation through real-time assessments of prices. Again, Truflation is not usually so far below the CPI. In fact, Truflation was higher than official numbers under Biden, with Truflation peaking around 17% during Bidenflation, when official CPI was more like 9%. Whenever there are sizable differences between the two metrics, it's worth noting why, because that helps indicate which one is correct and which one is off. Now, there are 3 big differences between Truflation and CPI: timing, weights, and the bizarre way the BLS counts housing costs. Truflation monitors 35 million prices in real time, scraping data directly, including getting incredibly granular data like local sales and excise taxes. Well, BLS sends out secret shoppers every couple of weeks, a century-old methodology. They manually count a tiny fraction of the prices measured by Truflation, and some of the data is a month old by the time it's reported. Second is weights. Every index has to decide how much to weigh stuff because consumers don't spend the same amount on everything. For example, the impact of rent doubling is much greater than the price of eggs doubling because you spend a much larger portion of your income on rent. If your rent doubled, that would likely break the back of your monthly budget. But if your rent stays the same and the price of eggs doubled, that's a lot easier to cope with because it's a much smaller financial impact. So you don't want everything to count the same. The BLS uses a single in-house survey that's a year old, while Truflation supplements with Census Bureau updates, real-time credit card and transaction flows, and Nielsen's expenditure surveys. These methodologies are relatively close on most things except the single biggest expense for most Americans, housing. CPI gives housing about a 1/3 weight, but Truflation is closer to 1 in 4. That makes everything else weigh more in Truflation, so if gasoline or eggs are coming down, as they are now, it's a bigger deflationary impact in the Truflation index. But the kicker here is it's actually housing that's coming down now, along with rents. Even the slight easing of interest rates over the last several months has brought more supply to the market, especially for existing homes. Econ 101 tells us that more supply puts downward pressure on prices, and that's exactly what we're seeing in the housing market today. The even bigger impact is deporting 2.5 million illegals, which frees up a lot of housing. Illegals tend to rent, and last month's rents nationwide were down double digits at an annualized rate. Home prices are actually falling in deportation-heavy cities like Austin, Dallas, Phoenix, Tampa, and Miami. But it's not just the weights, it's the bizarre lag BLS uses on housing. Instead of actually measuring house prices and interest rates, the two largest determinants in your monthly mortgage payment, the BLS imputes a phantom number called owner's equivalent rent to guess what you'd receive if you rented your house in which you currently live. Then they delay that number by several months on the rationale that most rents don't renegotiate every month. You typically lock in a monthly rent price for a year-long term. But that's like saying we should use 2018 car prices because people keep their cars for 8 years. Consequently, BLS's metric is about 8 to 12 months behind real-time changes in the housing market, which of course are what's being captured by Truflation and similar indexes. Now, when both home prices and rents are slowly, steadily increasing for many years uninterrupted, the official inflation numbers are reasonably accurate, but not when the housing market undergoes any significant change, which is precisely what happened beginning in 2021. This means the official numbers essentially ignored the single biggest source of inflation under Biden, housing, and they're ignoring the single biggest source of deflation under Trump. They'll keep ignoring it through 2027 until the lagging metrics catch up to reality. Ironically, recent official inflation readings were still attributing housing inflation from the Biden term to the data published during Trump's first year back in office. But now we come back to the distinction we drew earlier between inflation coming down and prices coming down. Americans don't want prices that are only a little higher than Biden. They want lower prices or deflation. We've discussed previously how Trump's been throwing the executive order kitchen sink at costs in energy, housing, food, and healthcare, but the heavy lifting must come from Congress, especially in the form of lower government spending. But lower interest rates would also bring relief to consumers. And if Trump's new nominee for Fed chairman, Kevin Warsh, is confirmed by the Senate, the president and the American people might just get the lower interest rates for which we've all been waiting and which are justified by the current levels of inflation, which are only a fraction of 1%. But more on Kevin Warsh in the next video. This is E.J. Antoni for the Daily Signal.